He lost his home and went into the forest. People laughed at him, filmed videos, and waited for him to give up. But what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The city had once woken every morning to the same sound, a deep industrial hum that rose from the factories along the river and rolled through the narrow streets like a tide. It had been the pulse of everything here, the rhythm that told people when to rise, when to hurry, when to rest. Now the mornings came wrapped in a silence so heavy it pressed against the windows. The old brick buildings stood with their mouths bricked shut, tall smokestacks no longer coughing clouds into the sky, loading docks sealed with rusted chains that rattled faintly in the wind like bones. Paper notices fluttered on doors announcing closures, auctions, final sales, each one a thin obituary for another piece of the town's life. The hero had grown up in the shadow of those factories. His father had worked the presses before him, his grandfather before that, all of them men who had measured time not in years, but in shifts and paydays. He had learned early that hands were meant to be useful, that a broken thing was an invitation to understand how it had been made. He had never been the kind of man who spoke easily about what he felt, but he could strip an engine in an afternoon, mend a chair so no one could tell where it had cracked, coax a stubborn door into closing flush with the frame. He belonged to this place in the way people belong to the soil that stains their boots. When the notice came, it was not dramatic. There was no line of supervisors or tearful speeches, only an email that arrived late in the evening with a subject line that sounded like a maintenance update. It informed him that his position had been eliminated due to restructuring, that he would receive a final paycheck and a short severance, that the company thanked him for his years of service. He read it twice, then a third time, waiting for some hidden clause to appear, something that would soften the blow, but the words did not change. The next morning he went to the factory out of habit, stood before locked gates where a guard he had known for years avoided his eyes, and told him the building was closed permanently. At first, he treated it like a temporary setback. He walked the town with a folder under his arm filled with certificates and faded letters of recommendation, knocking on doors of construction firms, warehouses, any place that looked like it might need a man who knew how to build and fix. Each time he was met with the same rehearsed sympathy. Business was slow. They would keep his details on file. He left his name behind until the folder was light with emptiness and heavy with the realization that no one was calling. The bills did not wait for him to find his footing. The landlord left notices under the door that grew less polite with each passing week. He sold what he could, first the spare tools, then the television, then the chair his father had made when he was young. He told himself it was only until something came through that he would replace these things later, but the word later began to feel like a story other people were allowed to believe in. Friends who had once shared beers with him after late shifts began to answer messages more slowly. They were not cruel, not openly, but they carried their own fears and did not want to look too long at a man who had fallen out of the race. The day he lost the apartment was bright in a way that felt like mockery. The landlord stood in the doorway while he packed his remaining belongings into 2 bags and a battered toolbox, the echoes of his footsteps too loud in rooms already stripped of life. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, some with pity, others with the faint relief of people who have learned that misfortune is contagious. He left the keys on the counter and walked out into a world that had decided he was finished with it. For a time, he tried to pretend he was not homeless. He slept in a cheap motel on the edge of town until the money ran out, then on the floor of a friend's garage, careful to leave early in the morning before his presence became an obligation. Eventually, even that courtesy wore thin, and he found himself sitting on a park bench at dawn, the chill seeping through his jacket, wondering when the ground had become harder than pride. The city watched him change. Someone took a photograph of him walking down Main Street with his bags slung over his shoulders and posted it online with a caption that asked, half in jest, half in judgment, how far a man had to fall before he stopped trying to look like he was still standing. The image traveled farther than he did, picked up comments from people who had never known him and did not need to. They called him a cautionary tale, a failure, a man who had missed his moment. He saw it once on a borrowed phone and did not look again, but the knowledge that strangers were narrating his collapse clung to him like a second skin. What hurt most was not the hunger or the cold, but the way people he had trusted began to speak to him in a new tone, as if he were already a memory. They offered advice that sounded like farewell speeches, told him about opportunities that never materialized, about distant cousins who had moved away and started over. He nodded and thanked them and walked away each time with the feeling that he was shrinking in their eyes, becoming smaller than the space he occupied. It was on one of those long, aimless afternoons that he found himself at the edge of the river that cut the town in two. The water moved steadily, indifferent to the factories that had once fed it waste and warmth, carrying leaves and bits of broken wood toward a horizon he could not see from here. Beyond the last row of abandoned houses, the land rose into a forested ridge, dark and dense and strangely inviting. He had walked those woods as a boy, fishing in the shallows, building crude shelters with his cousins, but he had not been back in years. Standing there now, with the city at his back, and the river whispering its promise of elsewhere, he felt a thought form that was at once absurd and inevitable. He did not announce his decision to anyone. The next morning, he shouldered his bags and crossed the river on foot, following a narrow trail that led away from paved streets and into the tangle of trees. The town watched him go, a solitary figure moving against the current of expectation, and did not bother to imagine what he might be going to do with the rest of his life. The first hours after he left the town were filled with a nervous energy that carried him deeper into the woods than he had planned. He moved along the river bank, following the low rumble of water that now sounded louder without the competing noise of traffic and machinery. The forest was still waking, mist hanging in thin veils between trunks, the ground soft beneath his boots. It was late autumn, the season when everything seemed to be preparing for sleep, and he could feel the urgency of it in the way the air bit at his skin. He did not yet know where he would stop. He only knew that he had crossed a line he could not retreat from, that the city he had left behind was no longer his to return to. By midday, he had chosen a narrow bend in the river where the current slowed and spread, carving small eddies around half-submerged stones. It was not a perfect place, but it had water, sheltering trees, and enough open ground to make a small fire without drawing attention. He set down his bags, collected fallen branches, and built a crude lean-to that leaned more on his determination than on its own strength. That night, he slept in bursts, waking at every unfamiliar sound, his body stiff with cold and the strange vulnerability of being alone in a place that did not know his name. The days that followed were a blur of trial and error. He learned which patches of ground turned to mud after rain and which held firm. He memorized the patterns of the river, the hours when its surface darkened and its voice deepened, the way driftwood collected in certain hollows. He made small improvements to his camp, little gestures of order that felt like acts of rebellion against the chaos of his life. Still, he knew it was temporary. Winter was approaching, and this was no way to meet it. It was on the fifth morning, while he was following the river upstream in search of better shelter, that he saw the log. It lay across a narrow ravine where the water plunged suddenly into a froth of white, a massive trunk that must have fallen in a storm years before. Moss clung to its underside, and its bark had peeled in long, pale strips, exposing a surface worn smooth by time and weather. To anyone else, it would have looked like another piece of forest debris, something to step over or photograph before moving on. To him, it was a revelation. He stood there for a long time, studying the way the trunk bridged the gap, how it was anchored on both sides by living trees whose roots wrapped around it like grasping hands. It was high enough above the water that the spray never reached its top, and wide enough that a man could stand upright along its length. He climbed onto it, testing its give, feeling the deep, solid resistance beneath his boots. It did not shift. It did not complain. It felt, improbably, like a foundation. That afternoon, he began clearing it. He stripped away loose bark, scraping at the patches where rot threatened to take hold, exposing the pale, sturdy heartwood beneath. His hands blistered and split, but he did not slow. He worked until the light failed, then built a small fire at the ravine's edge and stared at the trunk across the gap, as if it were a living thing he had just met and did not yet fully trust. In the days that followed, he returned to the outskirts of the town he had left behind, skirting its edge like a ghost, searching through discarded piles behind closed stores and abandoned houses. He found old windows with cracked frames, lengths of wire, a battered door that someone had tossed out during a remodel. Each piece he hauled back into the forest with a patience born of necessity, tying them into bundles and dragging them along trails only he now used. People saw him passing and took pictures, their lenses catching a man burdened with what looked like refuse, and they laughed at the idea of him building anything out of it. Back at the ravine, he laid out his finds and began to imagine them as parts of something whole. He carved an opening in the trunk just wide enough to crawl through, then widened it carefully, reinforcing the edges with strips of metal hammered flat. He cut channels along the interior to make room for boards that would become a floor, lifting his sleeping place away from the damp wood. It was exhausting work, the kind that emptied his muscles and left his hands trembling at night, but it was also the first thing he had done in months that made him feel undeniably useful. The videos began to appear before he realized he had become a subject. A teenager had filmed him hauling a warped door down a forest path and posted it with a caption that questioned his sanity. Others followed, each clip shorter and sharper than the last, stripping his labor of context until it became a joke in motion. People commented on the size of the log, on the futility of the effort, on how long it would take before the river claimed him. He did not see most of it, but he felt its weight in the way strangers smirked when they passed him on the trail, in the offhand remarks he overheard when he ventured into town for supplies. He kept working. He shaped the interior of the trunk into a narrow corridor that curved gently with the natural line of the wood, a tunnel that felt strangely protective once he stood inside it. He cut openings for the windows he had salvaged, setting them at angles that caught the light without inviting the rain. Each night he returned to his small camp by the river, his clothes damp and his body aching, but his mind alive with possibilities. When he finally slept inside the hollowed trunk for the first time, crawling through the unfinished entrance and stretching out on the rough boards he had fitted by hand, he expected to feel exposed. Instead, he felt the calm he had not known since the factory gates had closed on him. The river thundered below, but the sound was distant now, filtered through layers of wood that had weathered storms far greater than his own. He lay there, listening, aware that somewhere beyond the trees people were laughing at the idea of him living in a log, and smiled into the darkness because for the first time since he had lost everything, he was certain he had found the beginning of something no one else could see yet. When he woke inside the hollowed trunk the following morning, the light was thin and gray, filtering through the small opening he had cut the day before. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the river rushing below him, feeling the slow warmth of his own breath against the cold wood. The space was narrow and unfinished, but it was his, and that knowledge wrapped around him like a blanket he had not realized he needed. He rose carefully, stretching stiff limbs, and crawled out to face another day of work that no one had asked him to do and no one yet believed in. From that morning on, he set himself a routine. He woke with the first hint of dawn, ate sparingly from the small stash he had brought with him, then spent hours shaping the trunk from the inside, carving channels, shaving splinters, fitting boards into place with a precision that came not from blueprints, but from instinct. He had no tape measure, no level, but he had a sense for balance that he had learned on factory floors where a millimeter could decide whether a machine ran smoothly or tore itself apart. He used it now to coax a sense of order out of chaos. The forest was no longer a silent witness. Word of the man building a house inside a log had spread beyond idle curiosity. People came deliberately now, some alone, some in small groups, their phones already raised before they had fully emerged from the trees. They filmed him as he hauled a salvaged window up the rough path, as he balanced on the trunk with his arms full of warped boards, as he knelt inside the log hammering metal flat against the wood. They did not speak to him, or if they did, their words were swallowed by the river, but he saw their smiles, the way they leaned together as if sharing a joke he was not allowed to hear. He built a ladder first, crude but sturdy, wedging its feet into notches he carved in the earth on either side of the ravine. He tested it again and again before trusting his weight to it, feeling the wood flex beneath him, learning where it complained and where it held firm. Once it was in place, he could carry materials more easily, and that alone changed the rhythm of his days. He installed the first window soon after, fitting it into the curved wall of the trunk and sealing the gaps with strips of cloth soaked in resin he had boiled down from tree sap. When the light poured through that pane and spilled across the rough boards of his floor, he laughed aloud for the first time since leaving the town. The laughter from the other side of the lens grew louder. Someone edited a compilation of his early struggles, the slips, the moments when a board refused to fit or a knot would not hold, and set it to jaunty music. It was shared widely, becoming a small piece of entertainment in a world hungry for distraction. He did not watch it, but he saw its echoes in the way people now arrived expecting a performance. They waited for him to fail spectacularly, to drop something into the river, to lose his balance and tumble. Their anticipation hung in the air like the promise of applause after a misstep. Nature did not conspire to make his work easier. Autumn rains soaked the forest, turning the ground into a trap that sucked at his boots and left his clothes perpetually damp. He built makeshift gutters along the top of the trunk to divert water away from the entrance, shaping them from strips of bark and scrap metal, fastening them with wire he twisted by hand. Some nights he fell asleep with his hands raw and bleeding, too tired to care about the way his body protested. Still, he woke before dawn, driven less by stubbornness now than by a growing sense of responsibility to the space he was creating. As the interior of the trunk took shape, it began to feel less like a tunnel and more like a corridor. He added a second window at the far end, smaller than the first, its glass fogging over in the cold mornings until he learned to angle it to catch the sun. He partitioned the space with thin walls, marking out where he would sleep and where he would cook, where he would store the few belongings that had survived his departure from the city. Each change made the place more defensible, more clearly a home, and less an experiment. The nights grew colder, the river louder. He learned the language of the forest in the dark, the different voices of wind in the leaves and water on stone, the way the whole world seemed to breathe around him. It was during one of those nights, when rain drummed steadily on the trunk, and he lay awake wondering how long his supplies would last, that he realized he was no longer afraid of being here. The fear that had followed him from the city had been replaced by something quieter but more enduring, a determination to see this strange project through to whatever end it demanded. On a morning that began like any other, he carried a salvage door up the ladder and into the log, maneuvering it into place with a patience that made the watching crowd restless. He shaved its edges to fit the curved opening he had cut, testing it over and over until it swung smoothly, sealing the interior from the damp air outside. When he finally stepped back and closed it, standing alone in the dim light of his new shelter, the river's roar became a distant murmur. The forest could not reach him in here. He stood in that quiet and understood, with a clarity that startled him, that his house had begun to hold. Once the door could be closed and the interior of the log no longer felt like an open wound to the forest, his work changed in character. The early days had been about visibility, about the crude proof that a man could hollow out a fallen tree and survive inside it. Now the labor retreated from the eyes of the watchers and into the hidden spaces that no camera would ever linger on. It was here, beyond the curiosity of strangers, that he began to build the true heart of the house. He spent long hours studying the trunk from the inside, running his hands along the curves of its walls, listening to the sound it made when he knocked in different places. Years of working around heavy machinery had taught him that materials spoke in subtle ways if he learned how to listen. A hollow thud could mean weakness. A sharp, ringing knock meant density, strength, something to trust. He marked these places with charcoal, sketching a map of the log's interior that existed only in his mind, a private blueprint that no one else would ever see. The ravine was deeper than it had looked at first. When he leaned out from the entrance and peered down, the water appeared deceptively calm in certain stretches, but he had learned to watch the debris it carried, to judge its speed by the way branches vanished around the bend. He did not want a house that merely perched above the river. He wanted one that could endure its worst moods. To that end, he began threading lengths of salvaged wire and cable through the body of the log, drilling narrow channels that allowed him to lace the trunk to the living trees on either side of the ravine. He chose those trees carefully, old growth with roots that gripped stone, trunks that bore the scars of storms they had already survived. He wrapped the cables in cloth and bark so they would not chafe, hiding the gleam of metal beneath the textures of the forest. This system of hidden tension was the spine of his creation. He tested it in small ways at first, hanging his weight from different points, bouncing gently to see how the log responded. Where it swayed too freely, he added more support, tying the cables off at angles that redistributed the stress rather than concentrating it. It was work that demanded patience, a willingness to climb down into the ravine and back up again dozens of times in a day, adjusting, tightening, loosening, until the structure settled into a quiet equilibrium. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like he was simply tying knots and untangling them, a pointless ritual performed by a man too stubborn to admit defeat. Inside the log, he began layering the walls. He packed moss and dried leaves into the spaces between the trunk and the thin wooden panels he had fitted, sealing them behind a second skin of salvaged boards. This was not the sort of insulation he had learned about in textbooks, but he knew from childhood shelters that the forest itself offered materials more forgiving than anything you could buy. He pressed his ear to the wall at night and listened to the wind, gauging where it found purchase, where it slipped through unnoticed. Each morning, he returned to those places with more filler, more makeshift barriers, until the interior took on a surprising stillness. Fire was both a promise and a threat. He needed heat to survive the coming winter, but he could not afford a single mistake. He built his stove from a dented metal drum he had found behind a shuttered warehouse, cutting it open and reshaping it with careful blows until it fit the narrow space he had set aside. He lined the surrounding wood with scraps of sheet metal and stone, creating a protective shell that would reflect heat inward and shield the walls from sparks. The chimney was a challenge of a different order. He did not want smoke rising in a visible column that would draw attention or betray his presence to the wrong kind of curiosity. Instead, he ran the flue through a maze of angles inside the trunk before letting it emerge high above the roof, dispersing the exhaust so that it vanished into the canopy. Water, too, demanded its own quiet ingenuity. The river was generous but unpredictable, clouding with silt after heavy rain, carrying the remnants of upstream lives in its flow. He fashioned a filtration system from layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth packed into a series of tubes he mounted beneath the floor. A small pump, rescued from an abandoned greenhouse, drew water upward into sealed containers where it could settle before being used. He tested the system obsessively, watching the clarity of the liquid as it moved through each stage, discarding entire batches when they did not meet his unspoken standard. Power came last, not because it was unimportant, but because it was a luxury he had not dared to hope for at the start. He had found a pair of small solar panels discarded behind an electronics store, their surfaces scratched but intact. He mounted them along the top of the trunk where the sun lingered longest in the afternoon, wiring them to a battery salvaged from a wrecked car. When he flicked the switch for the first time and a faint glow spread across the interior, he sat down on the floor and closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the quiet miracle of light where none had existed before. He built storage everywhere, though you would not have known it from a casual glance. Panels slid aside to reveal narrow cavities in the walls. Sections of the floor lifted to expose compartments where he tucked away food, tools, small objects that had followed him from the city and now seemed like relics from another life. He did not trust appearances, not anymore. He had learned how quickly people dismissed what they did not understand, how easily they labeled something useless or broken. His house would never betray him that way. By the time the first frost silvered the forest floor, the work that mattered most was already done, though no one else could have said what had changed. From the outside it was still a log straddling a ravine, still the butt of jokes and idle speculation. Inside, it had become a network of hidden strengths, a structure that flexed and breathed with the land rather than standing against it. He moved through it now with a sense of ownership that was deeper than pride, a feeling that he had built not just walls and floors, but a small, defiant order in a world that had cast him aside. The first real cold settled into the forest almost without warning. One day, the river still ran brown and swollen from autumn rain. The next, its edges were laced with a brittle sheen that cracked when stones nudged it from below. He noticed it not by the look of the water, but by the way his breath fogged the air inside the log when he woke. A pale cloud that lingered instead of vanishing at once. The forest had entered the season that people in the town talked about with a kind of resigned dread, the months when every mistake was amplified and even the smallest oversight could become fatal. He moved through the house with a new attentiveness, as if the building itself had become a living thing whose moods he needed to understand. He ran his hands along the walls and felt where the cold pressed hardest, marking those spots with charcoal the way he had earlier marked the strong points in the wood. The insulation he had packed into the spaces between panels had been enough for damp autumn nights, but winter demanded more. He added layers, stuffing every crevice he could reach with moss, strips of old blankets, even shreds of clothing he no longer needed. He closed off drafts with careful adjustments to the door frame, shaving and reseating it until it met the curved edge of the trunk with a sigh of displaced air rather than a whistle. The stove became the center of his world. He fed it with the kind of deliberation that bordered on reverence, laying each piece of wood in a pattern that encouraged slow, steady combustion rather than sudden flare. He learned how much heat it could give before the metal grew too hot to trust, and how little he could allow before the interior temperature dipped into the danger zone. At night, he slept in short intervals, waking to check the coals, his dreams tangled with the hiss of embers and the creak of wood contracting in the cold. Outside, the forest withdrew. Birds vanished first, their chatter replaced by a silence that felt almost physical. The ground hardened under his boots, and the paths he had worn into the earth over months of hauling materials disappeared beneath a thin crust of ice. He ventured into the outskirts of town less frequently now, wary of the way his breath plumed in the open and announced his presence. When he did go, he felt eyes on him, not just the lenses of phones, but the more calculating gazes of people who had begun to regard his isolation as a kind of wager. The predictions started circulating in earnest then. He caught fragments of them when he stopped by the library to use a public computer, or when he scrolled through borrowed devices in the shadows of closed shops. They said he would not make it through the winter, that the river would freeze him out, or that the first serious storm would tear his foolish structure apart. Some of the comments were couched in concern, but most carried the same underlying tone he had come to recognize, the excitement of waiting for a spectacle to conclude the story they had been telling about him. He took stock of his supplies and realized how narrow the margins were. Food was the most immediate concern. He had stored what he could, but winter stretched ahead like a test he had not fully prepared for. He began rationing with a discipline that felt almost ceremonial, measuring out portions of rice and dried beans, supplementing them with whatever he could forage in the brief windows when the forest still offered something edible. He trapped small animals when he had the chance, thanking them in his head for the sustenance they provided, and dried what he could above the stove to preserve it. The river changed as the season deepened. It did not freeze solid, not in this narrow ravine where the current was strongest, but it thickened, its surface darkening as ice formed along the banks and crept inward in jagged fingers. He watched it obsessively, marking the water line on the stones below the log, tracking its subtle rises and falls. The house had been built to ride out anger, not to deny it, but he needed to know what he was facing long before it arrived. The forest tested him in small, cruel ways. One night a gust of wind tore a branch loose from a tree above and sent it crashing against the side of the log, jolting him awake with a sound like an explosion. He spent the rest of the night crouched near the door, listening for the next impact, feeling the cables he had hidden in the walls vibrate and then settle back into their tense, quiet hold. Another evening, he discovered that a family of squirrels had gnawed their way into one of his outer layers, forcing him to patch the breach in numb fingers while snow began to fall in earnest. Loneliness crept in alongside the cold. Without the casual intrusion of visitors, the days blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of his own labor and the relentless progression of the season. He spoke aloud, sometimes just to remind himself of the sound of his voice, narrating the work he was doing, cursing softly when something refused to cooperate. In the deepest hours of night, when the wind made the trunk groan and the river roared unseen below, he allowed himself to remember the town, the warmth of crowded rooms and familiar faces, and he felt a twist of longing that surprised him with its force. Yet it was also during those long, isolated weeks that something in him settled into a new shape. He no longer measured his worth against the standards of the place he had left behind. The city had taught him to equate survival with employment, with addresses and obligations, and the ability to explain oneself to others. Here, in the narrow corridor of his log, survival had become simpler and more profound. It was the knowledge that he had built this shelter with his own hands, that every beam and wire and patch of insulation represented a choice he had made in the face of doubt. As the winter deepened, the river began to behave in ways he had not yet seen. It rose after days of unbroken rain, its voice growing louder, more insistent, carrying with it the dull thunder of debris colliding in the dark. He marked the water line again and saw that it had climbed higher than it had in any of his previous records. He told himself it was temporary, that the forest was only rearranging itself as it always did, but the thought lingered, unwelcome and heavy, that the season had not yet shown him its worst. He had been watching the river for weeks, long enough to sense when its moods shifted in ways that were not part of the ordinary winter cycle. The rains came first, steady and unrelenting, soaking the forest until the ground could no longer absorb what fell from the sky. He listened to the change in the sound of the water from his bed inside the log, the way its murmur deepened into a growl that filled the ravine and crept into his dreams. Each morning, he climbed down to the stones below and marked the new line with a piece of charcoal, a private ritual that had become a form of prayer. The marks climbed faster than he liked. Where the water had once lapped at a flat rock near the bend, it now swept over it entirely, swirling in eddies that gnawed at the banks. He traced the cables that tied his house to the living trees and felt their tension increase, the whole structure leaning imperceptibly into the pull of the current. He tightened what he could, added fresh bindings where the bark had begun to wear away, and moved his most precious supplies into the hidden compartments beneath the floor. He did not panic, not yet, but he prepared with the calm of someone who understands that denial is more dangerous than fear. The night the flood truly began announced itself not with violence, but with a terrible steadiness. The rain had fallen all day, a gray veil that blurred the forest into a smear of dark shapes. At dusk, he made his rounds through the house, checking the stove, securing the door, adjusting the ventilation, flaps so the interior would not fill with damp. By the time he lay down, the river had become a single, unbroken roar, a sound that did not fade when he closed his eyes. Sleep came in fragments. Each time he drifted off, he dreamed of motion, of being carried along on a current he could not resist, and each time he woke, he found the house trembling gently around him. The vibrations were subtle, more like the purr of a great animal than the shudder of something about to fail, but they were constant, a reminder that the world outside had entered a state that did not consider his comfort. He rose in the darkness and moved through the narrow corridor, feeling the walls with his palms, noting where the cables sang faintly with strain. Sometime near dawn, a new sound joined the chorus of the river. It was the hollow, echoing crack of wood breaking somewhere upstream, followed by a deep splash that he felt more than heard. He climbed to the entrance and peered out into the rain. The ravine below was unrecognizable, its familiar stones swallowed by a torrent thick with branches, whole trees spinning end over end like toys. The water had climbed to a point he had never marked, and it was still rising. He did not waste time on what might have been. He returned to the interior and checked every point he could reach, tightening knots with numb fingers, reinforcing the door with a length of wire looped through its frame. He fed the stove carefully, not to warm himself, but to keep the metal from cooling too far, knowing that contraction could be as dangerous as heat in these conditions. Then he sat and waited, the house swaying slightly beneath him, a pendulum suspended above chaos. In the town, the flood was making headlines. Roads were washed out, basements filled, small outbuildings lifted from their foundations and carried away. Images circulated of muddy water surging through backyards and under bridges, of people standing in doorways with stunned expressions as their possessions disappeared downstream. Among the comments that followed these updates, someone mentioned the man in the forest, the one who had built a house in a log over a ravine. The remark was casual at first, then insistent, as if people suddenly remembered a side plot they had been neglecting. A group gathered before the rain had fully let up. They were not rescuers or officials, just locals, and a handful of those who had once filmed him for sport, now driven by a different kind of curiosity. They followed the river's course into the woods, slipping in the mud, swearing under their breath as they crossed paths that had become streams. They did not speak of what they expected to find, but the set of their shoulders and the way they kept glancing at the churning water betrayed their anticipation of an ending. They heard the house before they saw it, or rather, they heard the river and then noticed that above its tumult there was a shape that did not belong. Where the ravine narrowed, the log still spanned the gap, its pale underside slick with rain but intact, the cables that bound it to the trees vanishing into the wet bark like veins. The water tore past beneath it, carrying with it the remains of sheds and fences from far upstream, but the structure itself rode the violence with a stubborn grace. Inside, he felt the house settle after a particularly violent surge, a moment when the tension in the cables spiked and then eased as the trunk adjusted to the new reality of the river's height. He had braced himself for the possibility of impact, for the jolt that would signal the beginning of the end, but it did not come. Instead, there was a strange calm that descended in the eye of the storm, a sense that the worst had arrived and been met. When the group reached the edge of the ravine, they stopped as one. The house was there, whole, not the splintered wreckage they had half expected. Some of them raised their phones automatically, the reflex of months, but none of them spoke. The rain thinned to a drizzle, and in the relative quiet they could hear the faint creak of wood under tension, a sound that was not a cry of pain, but of endurance. They watched, waiting for something to give, and nothing did. They hesitated at first, a loose semicircle of figures standing at the torn edge of the ravine, rain dripping from their hoods and sleeves, their boots sinking into mud that only hours before had been solid ground. The river thundered below them, but it was no longer the only sound that mattered. The log house was there, undeniably real, a pale arc suspended above a chaos that had swallowed everything else in its path. Someone stepped forward, then stopped, as if the idea of approaching it required a new kind of courage. Inside, he had been listening to the unfamiliar quiet that followed the surge. The river still raged, but the violence of its arrival had passed, replaced by a sustained, brutal flow that he knew could last for days. He had expected exhaustion to take him when the danger eased, but instead he felt a tightening in his chest, a prickling awareness that he was no longer alone. He could sense movement beyond the walls, not the random shifts of wind and water, but the cautious tread of human feet. The door opened slowly, the metal hinges whispering as they gave way. He did not move at once, wanting to be certain of what he was seeing, and when he did stand, he did so deliberately, stepping into the small pool of light cast by the solar-powered lamp overhead. The first faces that met his were drained of their usual expressions. The easy amusement, the practiced smirk of people who had come to observe a curiosity, were gone. In their place was a kind of blank astonishment, a pause so complete it seemed to stretch the air between them. They entered, one by one, their bodies awkward in the narrow space, eyes darting from wall to wall as if searching for the trick that would explain what they were seeing. The interior was warm, the heat from the stove lingering even now, and the air was dry in a way that felt almost obscene given the torrent raging just beyond the door. Water beaded on their jackets and fell to the floor, but the boards absorbed it without complaint, the hidden drainage channels carrying it away to places they could not see. He watched them discover the details he had labored over in secrecy. They noticed the windows first, the way they were set into the curve of the trunk to catch the dim winter light without exposing the interior. Then the shelves, fitted so precisely into the walls that they seemed to have grown there. Someone brushed a hand over the metal shielding around the stove and flinched at its warmth, as if expecting it to burn. Another crouched to peer at the base of the wall where a narrow vent whispered softly, circulating air with a steadiness that defied the chaos outside. A panel slid open by accident, the result of a careless shoulder brushing against the wall, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Inside the narrow cavity were jars of dried food, carefully labeled, their contents arranged with a discipline that spoke of long planning and even longer patience. There were other compartments like it, revealed not by design, but by curiosity, each one a small confession of the life he had built here, of the care he had taken in a place most people had dismissed as a joke. The expressions on their faces shifted as the evidence mounted. Confusion gave way to something more difficult to name, a mixture of respect and embarrassment that hung between them like a weight. One of them, a man who had once posted a particularly cruel caption beneath a video of him slipping on wet bark, found a loose panel in the floor and lifted it, exposing a compartment filled with tools laid out as neatly as surgical instruments. The man closed it again without comment, his ears red. Outside, the river continued its assault, but here inside the log it might as well have been another world. The house did not creak or shudder now. It breathed, a subtle rhythm of tension and release that was felt rather than heard. He realized as he watched them that he had not simply survived the flood. He had anticipated it, met it on his own terms, and that understanding was slowly dawning in the people who had come expecting to witness a failure. The phones were out again, but the way they were held had changed. There was no jockeying for the best angle, no whispered jokes about capturing the moment. Instead, they filmed in silence, panning slowly across the space, lingering on the details that told the story he had never bothered to explain. The comments that would follow these images he could not predict, but he knew they would not be the same ones that had accompanied the early days of his labor. One of them discovered the water filtration system beneath the floor, tracing the path of the tubes with a finger, marveling aloud at the clarity of the water that pooled in a sealed container. Another found the battery bank tucked into a recess behind the stove, its indicator light glowing steadily despite the gloom outside. Each revelation added another layer to the dismantling of the narrative they had built about him, the one in which he was a man playing at survival rather than mastering it. He spoke then, not with the anger he had imagined he might feel if ever confronted by those who had mocked him, but with a simple explanation of how the house worked, where the air came from, how the cables were anchored to the trees, why the log had not shifted when the water rose. His voice was steady, almost conversational, and as he talked he saw their shoulders relax, the tension easing from them as they began to understand that this was not magic or madness, but the result of thought and effort carried to their natural conclusion. When they finally stepped back out into the rain, they did so reluctantly, casting glances over their shoulders as if the space behind them might vanish the moment they left it. The river roared just as fiercely as before, but now it seemed contained, framed by a structure that refused to yield. They stood together on the edge of the ravine, no longer a crowd, but something closer to witnesses, and the laughter that had once followed him into these woods was nowhere to be heard. The rain eased over the next day, thinning into a mist that drifted through the trees like smoke, but the river remained swollen and furious, as if it had not yet accepted that it had failed to claim what it had come for. The water line stayed high for hours, licking at rocks that usually stood dry even in spring, carrying branches and splintered boards in a constant, relentless procession. He watched it from the doorway of his log house with a calm that felt unfamiliar, not because the danger had vanished, but because he had met it and remained standing. By evening, the first videos made their way back into town. They were not the short mocking clips that had once circulated like cheap entertainment, the ones cut to music and captions that invited strangers to laugh at the audacity of a man trying to build a home from trash. These new recordings moved slowly, almost reverently, lingering on the doorway, the warmth visible in the faint shimmer of air escaping into the cold, the dry boards beneath their boots, the steady glow of light where no power lines ran. In them the river's roar sounded like a warning and a triumph at once, and the house stood above it with a stubborn grace that made the footage feel less like a stunt and more like evidence. The shift in tone was immediate. People in town watched the same man they had dismissed now moving through the interior of a house that looked nothing like the crude shelter they had expected. They saw shelves, insulation, a stove that burned cleanly, a filtration system that produced clear water in the middle of a flood. They saw how the log was anchored, how it flexed with the pull of the cables rather than snapping against it. And perhaps, most unsettling of all, they saw that he did not perform for the camera. He did not smile at the attention or gesture for approval. He simply lived inside the result of his work, as if that had been the point all along. In the comment sections, old jokes resurfaced, but they were drowned quickly by a different kind of reaction. Some people wrote that they had been wrong, plainly and without flourish, as though admitting it was the only honest response left. Others tried to explain away their earlier cruelty, claiming they had only been teasing, that it had been harmless fun, but their words rang hollow beside the footage. A few deleted their old posts entirely, scrubbing their histories clean, as if shame could be erased with a click. Yet screenshots traveled, as they always did, and the town learned again that the internet did not forget. It only waited for context to make its cruelty undeniable. He was aware of the attention without seeking it. when he ventured to the outskirts of town for supplies in the days after the flood, people turned to look at him in a new way. The smirks were gone. The casual condescension had been replaced by an awkward respect that made them avert their eyes as often as they held his gaze. A man who had once shouted something crude at him from a truck now hesitated at a distance, as if uncertain whether he had the right to speak at all. An older woman, who had always watched him from her porch with a guarded expression, nodded once, a small gesture that felt heavier than words. Offers began to reach him, carried by acquaintances and strangers alike. Someone proposed an interview with a local paper, framing it as an inspiring story the town could use in a bleak season. Another person offered money, pressed into his hand with an embarrassed smile. A construction company owner sent word that there might be work for him if he was willing to come back. The attention arrived wrapped in different disguises, but beneath it he sensed a familiar hunger, the urge to turn his survival into something consumable, a narrative that could be packaged and shared. He did not reject everything, but he did not accept blindly either. The city had taught him what it meant to become an object, to be spoken about rather than spoken to, and he was wary of stepping back into that role. He accepted supplies when they were practical: bundles of insulation, a box of nails, a coil of durable rope, things he could use to strengthen the house further. He turned away the offers that felt like attempts to buy his gratitude, to make him part of someone else's redemption. He did not want to be a symbol for anyone. He wanted to remain a man who had built a shelter because he had needed it, nothing more. The flood receded slowly, leaving behind a scarred landscape. Along the river banks, debris collected in tangled heaps, furniture and broken fencing and fragments of lives carried from upstream. The town counted its losses in soggy piles left at curbside, in ruined basements and warped floorboards, in the bitter smell of mud that lingered long after the water retreated. Against that background, his house stood as a quiet contradiction. It had not been designed to impress, yet it had endured what so many conventional structures had not. That fact gnawed at people. It made them question the confidence with which they had dismissed him, the ease with which they had laughed at something they did not understand. For him, the days after the flood were not a victory lap, but a continuation of the same work he had been doing all along. He inspected the cables, checked for fraying, replaced the protective wrappings where bark had worn thin. He reinforced the points where the log had taken the greatest strain, adding supports not because it had failed, but because he understood now how close failure could come without announcing itself. He repaired small interior damages caused by vibration, tightened loose panels, cleaned soot from the stove's shield. His movements were unhurried, careful, the work of a man who trusted process more than applause. At night, when the forest was once again quiet enough that he could hear distant branches settling under their own weight, he sat near the stove and allowed memories to surface. He remembered the day he had walked out of his apartment with his bags and toolbox, the looks from behind curtains, the photograph taken without permission that had reduced his life to a joke online. He remembered the way his friends had stopped returning calls, the way strangers had spoken about him as though he were already gone. These recollections did not strike him with anger now so much as with a solemn understanding. The flood had not only tested the house. It had exposed the character of the town, the reflexive cruelty of people who feared becoming what they mocked. And yet, in the aftermath, he saw something else as well. He saw people helping each other clear debris, sharing pumps and generators, hauling ruined furniture to the street in silence. The same town that had laughed could also work, could also care, but its care had been selective, offered most readily to those who still fit within the borders of accepted life. He had lived outside those borders long enough now to understand how fragile they were. One afternoon, as the river finally began to shrink back into its familiar channel, he stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down. The stones he had marked with charcoal were visible again, the lines dark against wet rock, a record of how high the water had climbed. Below them, caught in a tangle of roots, was a broken plank painted the faded blue of a backyard fence. It was a small thing, hardly worth noticing, but it carried the weight of everything the flood had swept away. He felt a quiet gratitude that his own home, built from what others had thrown out, had survived. In the weeks that followed, the story of the log house settled into the town's consciousness like a stone dropped into deep water. It continued to be shared, but less as a novelty and more as a point of reference. People used it in arguments about resilience, about self-reliance, about what it meant to build with intention rather than appearance. Some romanticized it, making him into a folk hero, a lone man defying nature and society with nothing but his hands. He disliked that version of himself as much as he had disliked the earlier one. Both were distortions. Both stripped away the ordinary truth that he had simply done what he had to do. He returned less often to town as spring approached. The woods felt more honest. The river, calmer now, ran clear and cold, its surface catching light in narrow bands that slipped between the trees. The log house remained suspended above it, weathered and strange and quietly solid, a piece of human will embedded in the landscape. He continued to improve it, not because anyone was watching, but because the act of shaping his environment had become the foundation of his new life. On the morning, the first green buds appeared on the branches near the ravine. He stepped out onto the narrow platform he had built at the entrance, a simple porch that overlooked the water. The air smelled of damp earth and new growth. The river moved steadily below, no longer a threat but a reminder of what it could become. He sat with a mug of heated water in his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers, and watched the current carry away the last remnants of winter. Far behind him, in the town, people were still talking. Some spoke with admiration. Some spoke with regret. Some remained silent, unwilling to revisit the way they had once laughed. He did not need their words. The house above the ravine was answer enough, a testament not shouted, but lived. He had not built it to shock anyone. He had built it because the city had closed its doors, and he had refused to freeze on the doorstep. If this story made you feel something, don't leave just yet. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter, and check out the other stories waiting for you on the channel. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over.